Here's a question that might mess with your head. What if I told you that the St. Patrick's Day you celebrate every March 17th, the green beer, the giant parades, the corned beef and cabbage, even the color green itself, was mostly invented right here in America? Not in Ireland, not by the Catholic Church, right here on this side of the Atlantic. Now, here's your real question. Is the St. Patrick we toast every year truly the same historical figure who walked the hills of ancient Ireland? Or has America created something entirely different? A new saint, a new story, a new holiday? Grab your Guinness, because we're about to unpack the real story of St. Patrick's Day in America. And trust me, some of this will shock you.
Today, we're diving into one of the most misunderstood holidays on the American calendar. And I don't mean misunderstood like, oh, people get too drunk. I mean the entire origin story of how this day became what it is in the United States is completely different from what most people think. Most Americans believe St. Patrick's Day is a proud Irish tradition that immigrants brought over from the old country and that we've kept alive out of respect. And that's partly true. But the full picture is a lot more complicated and honestly, a lot more fascinating. Because here's the truth. The parades, born in America, the color green, adopted during Irish political rebellion and popularized here. Corned beef and cabbage, an Irish-American invention cooked up in the tenements in New York. And the saint himself, not Irish at all. So today, we're separating the mythology from the history and asking the big question: how did an ancient British missionary become the face of one of America's biggest party holidays?
Here's the core challenge with St. Patrick's Day in America. By the time it reached your city, with its bagpipers and green-dyed rivers, the real man had been buried under centuries of legend, myth, and, frankly, really good marketing. The real St. Patrick was born roughly in the late 4th or early 5th century. Historians believe around 385 AD, though the exact date isn't certain. Not in Ireland, but in Roman Britain, possibly in what is now Wales or Scotland. At 16, he was kidnapped by Irish raiders and spent 6 years in captivity as a slave, working primarily as a shepherd in the Irish countryside. He eventually escaped, converted to Christianity, became a priest, and then, remarkably, chose to return to Ireland to spread the faith. He died on March 17th in roughly 461 AD, though historians treat that date as an approximation rather than a certainty. So right away, the patron saint of Ireland wasn't Irish. That's already a twist. And the famous legends, Patrick driving all the snakes out of Ireland, there's just one problem. Ireland never had snakes to begin with. The island is surrounded by water too cold for snakes to migrate from Britain. That story is almost certainly a metaphor for Patrick driving out paganism, but it's stuck. The shamrock? Patrick supposedly used its 3 leaves to explain the Holy Trinity. A lovely story, but historians say there's no reliable evidence he ever did that. The shamrock became an Irish symbol during political rebellions against Britain in the 18th century, long after Patrick was gone. So before we even get to America, the man himself had already been transformed into a mythological figure. When Irish immigrants brought his feast day to the New World, they weren't just carrying a calendar date, they were carrying a symbol. And in America, symbols take on a life of their own. So how does a quiet religious feast day on the Irish calendar turn into one of the biggest party holidays in the United States? It starts with immigration. Lots and lots of immigration.
The first recorded St. Patrick's Day celebration in America may actually surprise you. Historians have found evidence suggesting a Spanish garrison town in St. Augustine, Florida, may have honored the saint as early as 1601, brought there likely by an Irish Catholic priest living in the settlement. But the more widely known early milestone is 1737 in Boston, where a group of more than 27 Presbyterian Irishmen, note Protestant, not Catholic, gathered for a dinner to celebrate their homeland and formed the Charitable Irish Society, which still holds an annual dinner to this day. Then, in 1762, Irish soldiers serving in the British colonial army marched through the streets of Lower Manhattan to a tavern, and that's considered the first St. Patrick's Day parade in New York. Not a grand civic celebration, a group of soldiers looking for a drink. In 1771, the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick held the first official organized celebration in Philadelphia, founded specifically to provide relief to incoming Irish immigrants. Notice something. In these early decades, St. Patrick's Day was less about the saint and more about the Irish community helping each other survive in a new country. Now, March 17, 1780, here's a fun one. General George Washington, in the middle of the Revolutionary War, officially declared March 17th a day of rest for his troops stationed in Morristown, New Jersey, as a gesture of solidarity with Ireland's own struggle against British rule. Noble move, George. He did, however, write in his letter that the day would not be, quote, attended with the least rioting or disorder. So Washington gave the soldiers St. Patrick's Day off, but with a strict no-fun policy. Classic. But the real explosion came in the mid-1800s. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 devastated Ireland. Over 1 million people died of starvation and disease. Another million fled, many crammed into overcrowded coffin ships, pouring into New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and beyond. And these immigrants did not receive a warm welcome. Signs reading "No Irish Need Apply" appeared in storefronts. The Irish were stereotyped as violent, disease-ridden drunks by nativist groups, particularly the so-called know-nothings. They were discriminated against, pushed into the worst jobs, and treated as second-class citizens. So what did the Irish do? They marched, loudly, publicly, together. St. Patrick's Day parades became a form of political resistance, a way to demonstrate that the Irish were here, they were organized, they were proud, and they weren't going anywhere. In 1848, several Irish societies in New York banded together to form one massive unified parade. It was a declaration of identity, and it worked. As the Irish community grew in political power in cities like New York and Chicago, local governments began to officially back St. Patrick's Day celebrations. The holiday was becoming part of the American fabric.
So when exactly did St. Patrick's Day stop being an Irish-American cultural event and become just American? I'd argue there were two turning points, one historical, one commercial. The historical turning point, the Civil War. Tens of thousands of Irish Americans served and fought in the Union Army, many forming their own regiments, like the famous Irish Brigade. When those soldiers came home, historian Mike McCormick puts it perfectly. They went out as second-class citizens and came back as heroes. Suddenly, Irish identity in America wasn't something to hide, it was something to be proud of. And St. Patrick's Day celebrations grew with that pride. By the late 19th century, St. Patrick's Day was being celebrated in New York, Boston, Chicago, New Orleans, San Francisco, and Savannah, Georgia, which, by the way, has hosted a parade since 1824 and is famously the only major American city that holds its parade on the actual date of March 17th every year instead of the nearest weekend. But the commercial turning point came after World War II, when American corporations discovered that holidays were marketing gold. St. Patrick's Day was suddenly everywhere, on greeting cards, in supermarkets, in bar promotions. The iconic image of the jolly, mischievous leprechaun, largely a product of American commercialization, turbocharged by Walt Disney's cheerful portrayal of the character. McDonald's launched its legendary Shamrock Shake. Green food coloring was added to everything imaginable. And then there's Chicago. Starting in 1962, the city began dyeing the Chicago River green every St. Patrick's Day, an event that has become one of the most iconic images of the holiday worldwide. Here's the real story behind it. City workers had been using green dye to trace sewage leaks in the river since 1955. It was Stephen Bailey of the Chicago Journeyman Plumbers Local Union who had the deliberate idea to repurpose that same dye for a St. Patrick's Day celebration, and the tradition was born, only in America. The ultimate proof that St. Patrick's Day had become a fully American holiday? Ireland itself eventually adopted the American version. In 1996, Dublin hosted its first ever multi-day St. Patrick's Day festival, modeled directly on the parades and celebrations that had developed in American cities. The country of Ireland basically imported its own holiday back from America. And here's perhaps the most telling fact of all. For most of Irish history, bars in Ireland were actually closed on St. Patrick's Day. It was a holy day, not a party day. The Irish laws requiring this weren't changed until 1970. Meanwhile, America had been throwing a massive pub crawl for over a century.
So let's bring it all together. Who is the St. Patrick that Americans celebrate every March 17th? He is part historical figure, a real 5th century British missionary who gave his life to spreading Christianity in Ireland and who has been honored in the Catholic calendar since 1631. He is part myth, the snake driver, the shamrock teacher, the magical protector of the Emerald Isle. And he is, perhaps most of all, a symbol, shaped and reshaped by generations of Irish immigrants in America who needed a rallying point, an identity, a reason to march through the streets of Boston and New York and Chicago and say, "We are here, we belong, we are proud." The American St. Patrick's Day we celebrate in America didn't come fully formed from Ireland. It was built here by people who were struggling, who were discriminated against, who channeled their pain and their pride into something colorful, loud, and defiant. The parade was their protest. The green was their flag. Over time, that message of identity transformed into something broader, a celebration that, as the saying goes, makes everyone Irish for a day. In corporate America, turned that feeling into a billion-dollar industry. Is the American St. Patrick's Day authentic? That depends on what you mean. It's not what March 17th looks like in the Irish countryside, but it is a genuinely American story of immigrants arriving with nothing, fighting for their place, and eventually leaving such a mark on this country that their feast day became a national celebration. And honestly, I think St. Patrick himself, a man who crossed dangerous waters, lived as an outsider, and built something new in a foreign land, would probably recognize that story. That's the real story of St. Patrick's Day in America. Drop a comment below. What's the most surprising thing you learned today? Did anything genuinely shock you? And if you found this video interesting, hit subscribe. We do this every week. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a Guinness that is not going to drink itself. Cheers.